Thank you and good morning, and thank you for attending the webinar today. Again, my name is Rich Herman. I'm the Director of Product at oseberg. I've got about now 31 years of experience in the industry, which is starting to sound like a very long time. Must mean I am actually getting old. I'm a geophysicist by background. I've spent the last probably 20 years in various product management positions, and I've worked for some large and some small companies, but many of the information providers over the last several years, including P2 and TGS, IHS, Drilling Info, but happy to be here at oseberg, where I've been heading up the product team over the last couple of years. You can get me via email at rich.oseberg.io, and I'll put that up also again at the end of the presentation. Just a little bit about oseberg. These days, I like to describe us really as an oil and gas data extraction company, as opposed to just a data company. We're getting quite good at extracting and transforming data. We deliver that data through a set of software and different types of web services, some of which you'll see today. And have recently started up a consulting business where we're actually working with customers with their data. The company is headquartered in Oklahoma City. I'm actually based here in Denver, which is where I'm speaking to you from today. And our customers tend to be primarily upstream and midstream companies, and they use our products to look at industry trends, competitive intelligence, new drilling and A&D opportunities, and hopefully, as you'll see today, maybe the opportunities to find some open acreage, even in some places that are traditionally thought as fairly crowded. As I mentioned, the data extraction part of our business, we're getting quite adept at applying artificial intelligence and machine learning, in particular natural language processing, to extract attributes from unstructured data. So that includes county lease records, state regulatory documents, and we transform that data that's generally almost always unstructured and non-standard to make it searchable. It can also be analyzed and put into GIS applications. And as I mentioned before, we're starting to work now with client proprietary data as well. So that's a little bit about oseberg. Let's dive into today's problem, which is really an open acreage problem. And the question is, in perhaps the hottest play in the world right now, how do you find a way in if you were late to the party? And we often hear these two things from clients. One, there's nothing open in the Permian, but we also hear number two, which was that we struggle to meet drilling obligations, and that could be due to financial constraints. It could be rig availability. A lot of times it's just lack of full visibility into the lease obligations, particularly after an acquisition or a merger situation, especially on non-core properties. So the question is, if number two is true, and people keep telling us that it is, then can number one also be true? And the reality is it's really not. But you really need to know where to look, and you need to look fast. These windows of opportunity don't stay open very long. A lot of times people are aware that they have to meet a drilling obligation, and for some external reason they're having trouble do it. It's not that they're not paying attention, they just can't maybe get a rig in there and get that well down. So these windows of opportunities don't stay open for long, but they're actually happening constantly. So how to find the needles in the haystack? What we're going to show today is a way to look for Pughed Out leases pretty much everywhere in the Texas Permian, and we'll get to that in a second. We'll show how to construct these potentially severing or severed acreage using a set of rolling time windows. Again, as I mentioned, it's a limited time of opportunity that you can look for these tracts that are potentially available. So we're going to create a set of rolling time windows so that you can look at months before and after the lease's primary term. So you can kind of see what may be expiring soon and what have expired recently. We're also going to check to see if there's any recent permitting or completion activity, because it may turn out that there is a well going down there, or somebody is paying attention and trying to get a well drilled. So we want to be able to compare the acreage to wellbore information. We do a couple other things that are kind of specific to the Permian, which is we like to try to eliminate state of Texas university lands just because they can show up as false positives based on our calculations, but in reality there generally is not a situation where the acreage can pew out. There's some other things we do. Probably don't want to reveal all the secret sauce today, but we do a couple other things as well just to validate and clean up the tracks that we're identifying. And then we publish these, as I mentioned earlier, really through a web service, in this case, a spatial map service. So we're utilizing an ArcGIS service from ESRI, which I assume many or most of you are familiar with, so that you can access this information from just about anywhere. And we also provide access to the lease information as well, which is a core data set for oseberg. So about that Pughed clause, I'm assuming that most people attending this webinar are probably familiar with the Pughed clause, but it's an important element of what we're developing here as far as identifying leases that could be prospective to be open. And so in general, a Pughed clause is a legal provision that's introduced in a lease that really limits the rights of the lessee to hold all of the areas, all the acreage, or the depths of leased property if their drilling or production obligations are not being met. These were introduced back in the 40s to protect lessors from a lessee holding an undue amount of acreage and not really drilling enough wells to drain the property. And there's two primary types of Pughed clauses. There's probably, seems like, an infinite permutation of language that's used to describe these, but you can split them into two main categories. One is called a vertical Pugh, or sometimes referred to as an acreage or a surface Pugh. And that really refers to the portion of land that's located outside of a production unit, such that the lands that are outside of a producing unit boundary at the end of the primary term cannot be retained by virtue of only production inside the unit. So if we've drilled a well here, if you look over here in the upper right, and we're holding a certain amount of acreage of that well, if the original lease entailed all of what's in the light green here, if you don't drill another well here to the northwest of this well, you don't get to hold that acreage. And really, in the other dimension is called a horizontal Pugh or a depth Pugh, and this refers to actually holding specific producing intervals in the subsurface. And these are frequently defined relative to absolute depths from the surface or some combination of geologic markers. For today's discussion, we're only going to concern ourselves with vertical Pughs. I'll mention depth Pughs briefly later, but we're not going to worry about that scenario today. It's quite complex, and we're going to limit today's investigations just to basically acreage or surface Pughed clauses. So how are we finding those Pughed clauses? One of the things I mentioned earlier is we are applying machine learning and NLP techniques to teach computers basically to read and interpret leases. So for the last several years, we started using pretty much human entry at first. We would use an application where an operator could read a lease provision, for example, in a PDF, and they could highlight it, and they could actually enter the various types of data into a database, including whether there is a Pughed clause or not. We also look for other types of legal clauses that can be in leases, including pooling clauses, cessation clauses, continuous drilling. I draw your attention down here to the bottom right. What's interesting here is you can see the annotator, the operator in this case, is labeled prediction. So this is a case where the computer, based on learning models that we've trained over the last couple of years, has essentially been able to read this lease and determine that in fact there is a Pughed clause present in the lease. And this is how we're starting to do this now at scale. These training models have been trained over the last couple of years, and we're getting quite good now at essentially just letting a computer look at a lease document, essentially read it on the fly, and create all the various attributes that need to be extracted from that lease. And that's how we're essentially processing now attributes and information and clauses from literally millions of oil and gas leases. The other important ingredient that goes into the Pughed Out acreage computation are what we call our Texas units. And there are many, many different types of units, and a full discussion of all the different types of definitions in units in Texas is going to be beyond the scope of today's webinar. But for today's purposes, we're going to be looking at what we call lease units or pooled units. And the outlines of these units can fortunately be found on the Railroad Commission W1 well permit applications. And there's kind of an example of that over on the right. What we're doing is we're actually digitizing, in this case, all of the W1 permits from about 15 counties in the Permian. And we do that really for any well that's been producing since 2010. So we go back about 10 years, and we actually find each and every plat, and we digitize essentially what is the lease unit, or if it's a pooled unit, the pooled boundary, and create a spatial polygon for that particular unit. One of the things we're careful to do is we update that unit with all new W1 plats. So as a lease is being developed and there's multiple wells being drilled onto that lease, as a new W1 is filed, we do not create a new separate polygon for that well. We're always looking at what the existing unit was prior to the drilling of that well, and then we amend and update that unit boundary to accommodate the additional well that's been drilled. We also update the operator of that unit using Railroad Commission transfer data, but we're not going to utilize that today. But it's another thing that oseberg does specifically around our units data set. So by virtue of the updates, our units reflect the most current earned acreage, so to speak, within the original lease. And so the magic calculation for us here is to look at the difference between the original lease outline. And we map the original lease outline by extracting the legal description, as I showed in the prior slide. In this case, again, we could be using a machine learning extraction to pull the legal description out of the lease. We put that through an auto mapping algorithm and actually create a polygon to represent the original lease boundary. And then we compare that to essentially what the current unit boundary is. The current unit boundary more or less represents all of the earned acreage of that lease up to the primary term. And when we look at the difference between those two, that's how we start to identify acreage that is potentially pewed out in a vertical or acreage sense. So a real simple example, we could apply any unit here. Let's assume for a moment it's a 640 acre lease. And let's say we can drill 4 wells at 160 acre spacing. We drill our first well down to the southeast, and essentially there's a unit that's defined for that well. It's provided in the W1 permit for that well. We digitize that unit boundary. A second well is drilled. Now the unit boundary is going to include both of those wells. We drill a third well. The unit boundary again gets updated to now include all 3 wells. And if that's all that's been drilled at the end of the primary term, then this northeast quarter, this 160 acre parcel, is potentially going to pew out. Because in this case, the lessee has not drilled enough wells to fulfill the spacing obligations on this lease. And this 160 acre parcel could potentially be pewing out and available for lease by another party. So this is kind of a simplistic example, but it gives you a good idea of what we're doing in the basic computation. So how do we get the lease units again from the W1? This is an example of our units data. This is a shell unit here. This is an example of the W1. It's a little bit hard to see that hatchet pattern, but we essentially outline and digitize the W1 plat, and that's what's used to create the polygon that goes into our map layer for that particular unit. So again, our pewed out acreage workflow here is essentially we're going to start with our leases, and there's lots of leases in this case. We're going to filter them by whether there is a pew clause or not. We are going to filter and create various time intervals by expiration date, so we can basically bracket the expiration windows. We're going to add our units data. You can see here in the case where we have units overlying leases, we know that there's production holding that portion of the lease. And now we're going to construct basically new polygons based on what would be a unitless lease, so to speak. We'll look and see if there's completions. We always look to see if there's a recent completion. If we're looking at this particular block in the center here, you notice there was one completion on the block, but it's back from 1980. And since there's no unit here, we're assuming that there's no recent production, but we've checked just to make sure. We'll also look and see if there's a recent permit. We also see a permit here that correlates to that older completion. So there's no recent permitting activity here. There is an original lease, there is no unit. So potentially this is a potential now pewed out acreage block. And so we do this basically en masse over 15 counties across all those different time horizons and create a set of polygons. So before I get into the demo here, just maybe some disclaimers and a quick discussion of potential false positives. First of all, This is still in beta, so you all know what that means. This was never intended to be perfect. There's not a perfect way with one easy button just to absolutely ensure to show what's open and what's not. But the purpose of what we're doing here is to get us all to the red zone faster, right? Let's get to the 10-yard line, maybe the 5-yard line, and we can do this continuously. So it's one way of looking at scale across hundreds of thousands of leases of what could potentially be pewing out or what has recently pewed out, and give you easy access to the additional information that you need to go in and determine whether it's truly open or not. Again, just a reminder, we're only talking here about vertical or acreage pews. We do have a bit of a blind spot between the permanent completion, so obviously that could be a span of many months. So it's a blind spot right now that we can't address, but I'll mention it here when we close up. We're not filtering yet for lease extensions, so I'll mention that. In fact, we'll drill into a couple of these, and you'll see where some of the leases do have extension terms, and it's quite possible that the lessee has executed that extension while they haven't drilled and satisfied the obligations on the primary term. They may be paying additional royalties, essentially, or bonuses to extend that lease. We're also having some issues with very long lateral bottom hole completions. So in some cases, we may be getting some false positives because we're not correctly intersecting the bottom hole completion with the lease polygon. We've seen that in a few cases. That's something that we're working on. And we're also not addressing discontiguous tracks right now. So if a lease is being held off production on another track that's miles away from it, we're not making that connection at the moment. And we're also not showing the production as a layer. So I talk a lot about production today. You won't see that as one of the map layers in the demo.